Welcome to the Lauder Institute at the University of Pennsylvania. I'm Jules van Binsbergen, director of the Institute and a finance professor at the Wharton School.
And I'm Jonathan Berk, a finance professor at the Graduate School of Business at Stanford University. This is the All Else Equal podcast. Welcome back, everybody. Today we're going to take on what probably is a more controversial subject than what we usually take on, which is what I would call the propensity of doctors to lie.
Well, Jonathan, let's first provide some more context, right? So why we think this question is interesting to address, right? I think that in the last couple decades, we've seen that experts and professionals have been gradually losing quite a bit of respect from the public. If you ask people about how much they value research that comes out of universities or how much they think financial experts know what they're talking about, and I think particularly since COVID, if you ask people their opinion about what they think about the expert opinion of medical professionals, I don't think we're doing so well. And I think that we need to figure out where that reputation loss is coming from and whether there's something that we can do to counter that. Because I think it's absolutely fundamental that experts get the credibility that they deserve. As a Bayesian decision maker, it cannot be that any person that just shouts anything gets equal weight in the decision-making process. It needs to be that we trust certain people more than others. But I do think, and that's the part that you're talking about, that then also comes with the responsibility of these experts to do whatever they can to maintain that reputation.
Yeah, so why this is all connected is if you're an expert and people trust you and you have an incentive to lie, supposedly for the public good, it may do good in the short term, but of course in the long term can be very costly. And this subject has come up before on the podcast. But in particular, in medicine, I think it's an issue. Let me just give you some examples. COVID is the place to start, I think. If you think about COVID, when COVID first started, there weren't enough masks. So what did the government tell us? Masks were not going to make a difference, provided no protection, even when they full knew that COVID was essentially a cold, and they all knew there was an airborne disease. They didn't really think masks provided no protection, but they wanted to save the masks for the emergency personnel. So they told the public it provided no protection. Then, once there was enough masks, they reversed themselves. Suddenly masks provided a lot of protection, which of course left the public wondering, which one is true. And then on the vaccine, when the vaccine came out, I remember saying, look, in clinical trials, it had 94% of people were protected from the virus. And my question is, what about the other 6%? And there were two choices here. The other 6%, the variation could have been caused by variation in human beings, or it could have been caused by variation in the virus. If it was the second, the vaccine would eventually stop working because it would select for the viruses that the vaccine would protect, leaving only the viruses it couldn't protect, and the new version would then take over. I think all health professionals knew it was the latter. And yet, nobody said, look, the vaccine will not protect you from COVID. It might protect you from getting the current version of COVID, but this thing mutates so fast, there'll be a new version quite quickly that it won't protect you. Again, because they wanted people to get vaccinated. Now, why exactly they wanted people to get vaccinated, I'm not exactly sure. Most likely, they probably knew that it would reduce the severity. But more likely, they also knew that the argument which is called herd immunity is actually a correct argument, which is by exposing the population, you build up antibodies. That means there's a bunch of COVID viruses that you're not going to be infected by, leaving only the viruses that you don't have immunity, but they didn't say that. And so that left people with the idea that they get lied to. And so now today, people are not taking the measles vaccine, which is insane. But it's because health professionals lied to the public.
Well, just to push back a little bit, Jonathan. So if we look back at COVID, right, there are a couple things that I think we need to be acknowledging. The first one is there are a lot of things that we know now that we didn't necessarily knew then. Or to be more precise about the statement as a statistician, there are statements that is less uncertainty about today compared to the uncertainty that was maybe the prior mean was the same, but there were certainly larger variants about the possibility what could have been going on. And secondly, I think a lot of people panicked and really thought that some of the things that you're talking about, if it takes too long to publicly educate and inform the public, and there's time pressure involved here to get something done, what is the best and most effective way then to get done what needs to get done? The hospitals that were overflowing, the dead bodies that were stored outside in various places, in hospitals in Italy and New York, and that therefore they thought that there was just no time for this idealistic truth-seeking argument where you can always say what needs to be said. And so I think we need to be sympathetic to the decision makers at the moment that these decisions had to be made. While also I think we need to indeed be explicit about there is a trade-off here. There is a trade-off in achieving short-term objectives and long-term objectives. And of course, the question is who makes that trade-off and puts value judgments on those two.
Let's make the assumption they did not know. And let's assume everything you said is true. I would still argue that the long-term costs are way larger than overflowing emergency rooms, because if the population does not believe what the experts are saying, and imagine we have COVID was bad, but really it was nothing compared to some of the epidemics. I mean, as you well know, almost the entire North American population was wiped out by smallpox. 1/4 of European population was wiped out by the plague.
Black Plague.
So we could have a really bad pandemic. And what if people don't believe it because of what happened with COVID? It seems to me that cost is enormous. And so to just say, well, it's an emergency, we can do whatever we want, I think that's a huge mistake.
No, that I agree with, although obviously reputations are restored and there's a timeline to that. And so the question is, how much time does it take to rebuild the confidence? And then, the question is, maybe there are some people that actually would still argue today that the public hasn't been lied to, right? I mean, it's not like there's a consensus on this. I do think that, more and more evidence is coming out on a regular basis that seems to be confirming what you're saying. But there's still a lot of disagreement about it today. Maybe also because, admitting now that these things were true will have quite bad consequences for how we now look back at the decisions were made at the time. Now, in terms of the trade-off, what can be done at this point to restore the confidence? If we wanted to solve this problem now, what would have to be done?
I don't think there's anything you can do. Once you lie like that, what are you going to say? Oh, no, we're not going to lie in the future. It's a perfect example of people not thinking equilibrium and all else equal mistake and ignoring the externality. I actually think it's worse than that, Jules. I think the medical professional accepts lying as part of the treatment. I think it's the case that there's this view in medicine that the doctor has to understand the patient. And if the doctor is so understanding that he knows the patient wants to be lied to, then he should lie to the patient.
Yeah, no, I agree with that, although I would counter that part of the social skills that we all develop, and Jonathan, we do it too with our students, right? Which is we will vary our communication style depending on the student that we're dealing with, right? I mean, we had Billy King on the show about, I don't know whether you remember the thing that he said, right? You need to treat everybody fairly, but not equally. And what he meant with that was that what you tell people, how you motivate them, and what you do is going to be different depending on the person that you're dealing with, even if the actions that they've been doing are pretty similar. So the fact that we adjust our behavior and communication to the other person who's on the receiving end of the communication, don't you think that that's pretty standard in most of communication in society, not just in medicine?
Yes, I agree with you, Jules. I'm not saying there aren't times when the patient's better off in their own mind by the doctor not telling the truth. The problem is it spills over. What I think the medical profession does not take seriously enough is the all else equal mistake, right? The externality, not realizing that there's a cost to the lying if other people could observe it, if it's a repeated game, and that that cost can be substantial. The fact of the matter is, we're having people who are not taking vaccines right now, vaccines that we know cure, and then we're in trouble, and I think this is something that the medical profession should think about.
So I think you're completely right about that. And I think it would be very good to try to measure, quantify through surveys or otherwise, how many people today are not taking vaccines because of what happened in 2020 to 2022. To the extent that that's measurable, I think that is a way of quantifying the trade-off, the short-term versus the long-term trade-off, and then also try to measure how long such effects persist. Is this a temporary thing that in 3 years everybody will have forgotten about and we're back to normal vaccine use? Or is this a structural shock that's going to last 20 years before we're back to levels of vaccination that we saw before this? That's an empirical question. I'm not sure we know the answer to that.
Yeah, I think that would be an interesting study. Well, on that note, Jules, why don't we introduce our guest today? Our guest today is John Ioannidis, a professor of medicine at Stanford University. He's a returning guest to our show. He is also one of the most widely cited researchers in all of medicine. And one of his most cited articles is entitled, "Why Most Published Research Findings Are False," and is the most accessed article in the history of the Public Library of Science. So John, I would say, is not afraid to speak his mind. John, welcome to the show.
Thank you for inviting me.
It's great to have you again, John.
Well, I think today we have a pretty controversial topic to discuss. Certainly when I talk to doctors about it, they get very defensive. But I would say, and I think we've had discussions between the two of us before, that in medicine, it's acceptable and maybe even taught in medical schools that it's okay sometimes to not tell the truth to your patients. And John, do you firstly agree with me on that?
Officially, no. I think that teaching that would be unethical and one would not be able to do it in an official curriculum, lie to your patients. But in reality, probably in many cultures and in many settings, physicians tend to be taught to feel powerful, to feel like they know and they know what is best for their patients and try to convince them, try to make sure that they follow what they're suggesting, and even worse, sometimes manipulate information in a way that they will agree. In some cultures, overt lying is also happening. Even relatives might say, well, you should not tell the truth because they will not tolerate it, and just find a way to deal with the problem, but don't tell them that they have cancer or don't tell them that they face this major problem. So it's highly culturally dependent. It's not acceptable. I think it's unethical at its very basis, but it has some roots that could go pretty deep into how medicine is practiced or malpracticed.
But John, I get that you think it's unethical. We agree with you. I think it is unethical. I don't agree with you, and I think it's pretty common for doctors to do this anyway. And let me give you an example. Fauci, at the very beginning of COVID, knew that we were running out of masks. And so what he told everybody is masks didn't work, even though he knew he had an airborne disease, and he knew that masks would work. But he wanted to save the masks for the healthcare professionals, right? Once there was enough masks, he reversed his position. Oh, no, we all have to wear masks. And I saw that as a pretty good example of a medical professional saying, well, it's in the public good for me not to tell the truth.
Indeed, there is a temptation to do that, to follow that stance, both in one-to-one situations with patients and even more so in public health, where we believe that there's a lot at stake and we can save not only just a single patient, but hundreds of lives and thousands and millions of people if we do things that are optimal. So it's possible that often we feel very strongly about what we know, we think that we know, and how we want to make sure that this gets implemented. And we may be misled very often. You mentioned an example about masks. Personally, I thought that masks would have some effectiveness, probably not tremendous effectiveness, but I thought that they would have some effectiveness. But for someone who's very strongly convinced that this is the way to go, and this is the way to save lives, they might even convince themselves to interpret the evidence in a given way. And then they might try to convince others by painting a picture that is commensurate with what they want to achieve. But the motto of the means are okay, provided that we achieve the end, is very problematic in medicine when you distort evidence or silence evidence or just lie in order to try to get an outcome that you think is the best. In the best circumstances, you achieve that outcome, but you have lied to people, you have lost their trust eventually, and next time it's going to be horrible.
I completely agree with you, John. But let me just, for the fun of it, take the other side of the argument a little bit. So the word paternalism comes from being a parent, right?
Yes.
So I think that every person who has been a parent has at some point lied to their children about particular decisions that they were making at certain age groups. I don't think this is a particularly controversial statement to say that we sometimes tell our kids things that aren't true because we think their behavior will improve if we do so, right? And so it's a well-tested strategy, and given the fact that everybody does it, and I even think that most parents would say, actually, I still support that. I did that in the past. Now, maybe there are parents that have radical truth strategies with their kids, but I think that, for certain ages, there are just certain things that you should definitely not tell your kids or tell them things that are just different than the truth. So once we think about that maturing process, and maybe more than with maturity, it has to do with the development of expertise and the ability to handle information. Can you not now put the argument on a sliding scale and say, aren't there circumstances for which, if you know that patients are in similar situations, that you would do the same thing? Why is that any different from that parent that is trying to get the best for their child?
Interesting take on what we're discussing. But I think physicians in public health are not parents, and patients in the population are not children. I mean, they might include children and their parents as well. But basically, it's not the same kind of relationship. We are all citizens. We all have rights. We all believe that we should try to trust each other. We believe in a shared community, in some shared vision. Hopefully, that is really questioned at the moment, whether there's even a shared vision for our communities nowadays. But ideally, we want to have that. So thinking that someone is more powerful and another one is more like a toy to be exploited or to be manipulated or to be instructed in a way that they lose their autonomy and their ability to make decisions for themselves that are informed, well-informed, I think that creates a very explosive mix. The real challenge is how to convey information that may be very technical, very convoluted, sometimes mathematically complicated and not easy to digest, or there may be a lot of biology that one needs to have a PhD to really understand what is the exact mechanism and how this thing works and how are we applying it and why. Or there may be also a lot of math or statistics in the evidence that maybe the average citizen is not prepared, is not trained to understand. So that means that dense information needs to be converted into something that a person who has just basic education would be able to understand. And this is a challenge, but that doesn't mean that we're going to lie about that translation into very basic, fundamental, easily understood language. In fact, we have to be very careful that the translation to basic language corresponds to the same level of certainty, uncertainty, knowledge, lack of knowledge, strengths, weaknesses, pros, cons, benefits, harms, as the, let's say, complete evidence that the professor at Stanford can understand, but very few others might. So this is a challenge, but in order to achieve a proper translation, rule number one is that we're not trying to lie in trying to translate. We're just trying to make this easier for everyone to understand what is going on and have a one-to-one kind of correspondence for the main points or for what really matters.
But John, wouldn't you say that in medical school, people are taught concepts like what is in the interest of the patient?
They should.
But how can they determine that? I mean, in other words, you're not in my head. You can give me the evidence of what the treatments are.
Yes.
But the paternalistic approach is, and I'm going to tell you what's in your interests.
Well, they should be taught to try to figure out what is in the interest of the patient. But this is not written in a textbook. This is practically something that only the patient knows about themselves, and it may also change in different circumstances. So physicians should present the possibilities, the alternatives, what we have available, how much would you expect with each one of these options, how each of these options is going to be implemented, what does it mean in terms of cost, in terms of potential harms, in terms of your life, how often you need to come to the hospital, what's going to happen with your job, what's going to happen with your relationships. They need to have a very broad picture of what proposed interventions might do. But for each patient, what they might do might be different because of the very special circumstances, preferences, beliefs, priorities of that particular patient. And the same applies to communities. Communities may have different resources, different fundamental problems, different structural inequalities, the different problems that are really having a major toll on them. And for each intervention, you need to factor all of these kind of special circumstances into account and get some consent from the community, get consent from the single patient, if it's a single patient, get consent from the community that this is really what I want to see done. Perhaps a physician or a public health person may think that, well, this seems to be the best intervention in an abstract way, based on my value system and based on how I put weight to different aspects of pros and cons. But that equation may not be the same for a patient. That equation may not be the same for a community. It has to be decided with shared decision making. This is completely fundamental in the definition of evidence-based medicine. We don't have evidence-based medicine unless we have shared decision making. If we don't have that, then we're in a very unethical ground.
What's so interesting about this, John, is that I think that in many ways we're in the similar situation as finance people as we are with medical people, right? Which is the following. All decisions have huge uncertainty associated with it. And so therefore the question is, how well can you communicate the uncertainty that's there? And is your job as, say, a financial advisor or an expert in finance, is it to just communicate the odds to the investor and then let the investor decide for themselves? Or do you actually make the decision for the investor and they say, this is what you should do? Given what you said about shared decision-making, I think you would argue that the latter is not what you're supposed to do. But what if the patient, if you give them all statistical odds and they tell you, all the statistical stuff doesn't work for me. I don't understand anything of what you're saying. Just tell me what I need to do. And actually, I think that in finance, we see some of that too, where people just say, just tell me what to put my money in. I don't want to think about all of these odds that you're asking me to deliberate on.
So this is not as unethical as lying to patients, and there could be some foundation that this may be justified in several circumstances, that the patient hears what you have to say, and then they say, I'm really sorry, but I don't think that I can decide. What would you do? What would you recommend? And, then as a physician or as someone in public health, I can recommend. I think the best thing is this, and perhaps the patient would accept that. I don't think that there's a problem with this, provided that I'm honest in communicating what I tried to communicate at the first step. Some patients are willing to, let's say, give away some of their autonomy, and maybe they even feel burdened that, oh goodness, I need to decide now about every step. I trust you. You're a good doctor. Let me do what you suggest. If we go down that path, at a minimum, we should make sure that the physician or whoever is the health person has done their best to communicate what is known and what is not known. So not try to get that signature, I sign off my rights.
Yeah, I agree.
Easily by hiding facts or by making them too complex. I could get to that point by making things sound amazingly complex, and then nobody understands what I'm talking about. Oh goodness, tell me what to do. That's also misleading, because perhaps I could make things easier to understand and I could make it pretty clear what is at stake here.
John, I think you're describing an ideal world, which I just don't experience. I don't think the world is like this. I think what routinely happens is doctors don't take the time to give you all the options. They don't wait for the patient to ask for their opinion. Instead, they routinely make decisions for patients. And that the paternalistic view of doctors is, I think, taught in medical schools, that somehow or other you have to do it in the patient's interests, and you're not. When I go to the doctor, it takes a lot of work from me to get the doctor to give me the facts that I really need to make the decision. He'd much rather say to me, you need surgery.
Yeah.
Well, like ask the question, how effective is surgery? How often does surgery work in this case, right? Even that question sometimes will elicit a defensive response.
I will not debate with you on this because I think your personal experience or experience from people we have heard about is likely to be, if not the norm, something that is very common indeed. And there's many reasons for that. There's very limited time for the patient-physician encounter. It's become very automated. It has been limited to just collecting some information for electronic health records, very little human communication, very little exchange in terms of questions and answers and then other questions. So yes, indeed, in real life, actually physicians who want to do a good job may actually find themselves in trouble because they spend more time. And, if you spend more time, you can be fired by Stanford because you spend more time. And I'm serious here. This is really the norm. I think we have lost our value system in the way that the medical practice has evolved. I think that medicine has become overblown. There's lots of things that medicine is offering and at a tremendous cost. Most of what we're offering is not really very effective, and some of what we're offering even has substantial harms. Not everything. We have lots of benefits. We have things that can really work, but we have lots of other things that we do, not only therapeutically, but in terms of prevention, in terms of diagnosis, in terms of workups, in terms of how we try to sustain a system that is reaching close to 20% of our GDP. So if you have that situation, you have very little time for real shared decision-making, for really talking with patients, for really dealing with human beings that have uncertainties and decision qualms, and they really want the best input to make up their minds. It becomes very automated. It's sad. I think many physicians who really want to do what is supposed to be good medicine and practice medicine the way that it should be practiced, they just leave the system, or perhaps they're terminated, or perhaps they might write some papers like me, but I'm not sure how effective that would be when you have fundamental dysfunctions that allow that malfunction to continue.
Do you think it affects the research? Do you think it's the case that funding for studies that might show a result that would not be in the public health interest is harder to get than funding for studies that might bolster what people think is in the public health interest?
So when it comes to getting evidence for implementation, for licensing, or for wider use in patient populations or in the community, most of the research is not done with public funds and with publicly designed studies, by independent investigators. It is done mostly by the industry and sponsors who clearly have a specific benefit in mind. They want to get one particular result far more compared to the opposite result.
Yeah, that's not good.
And that means that even though these studies might be well designed in terms of fulfilling some checklist that people like me may come up with to try to detect biases, once you have these checklists out, they will say, what did John Ioannidis and others want to see, because otherwise they will attack us. Okay, these 10 items, we'll do that. They will spend $500 million, sometimes more. So it's okay to spend some pennies to fulfill these, let's say, superficial, occasionally a bit more than superficial requirements. But the core of the design and of the research agenda will be such that it will maximize their profit. And maximizing their profit does not mean that they will maximize health benefits. It would be ideal if the two go hand in hand. Sometimes they will also get health benefits, but in many circumstances, they will just maximize profits with very little health benefit for individuals or for communities. And it will be very difficult to counter that because there's no one who has enough funds to design the studies that would be more appropriate and would ask them more appropriate questions and have the more appropriate outcomes and the more appropriate follow-up and get the evidence that we really need to be able to tell, should we really use these interventions and at what scale should we implement them? Much of that desirable evidence is missing because there's no one there to support it that we need to get it.
John, where my question was coming from was, I believe that in medicine and in research, medical research, there are biases that are driven by paternalistic motives. So let me give you a very specific example. Our colleague, Jay Bhattacharya, very early on in COVID, devised an experiment to test the actual prevalence of COVID in the population. We didn't know that. We were just measuring how many people showed up sick. And that study, he had a very, very hard time doing that study because I think people felt that they knew what he was going to find. He was going to find the probability of getting sick was much lower than what people were saying it was. It wasn't as bad a disease as was in the media. And I think the reason why people were pushing back and trying to stop him from doing that study is they didn't want that to come out because they thought that if it did come out, people would be less vigilant against COVID and that wouldn't be in the public interests. You think that's not common in medical research?
Sadly, that does happen. And I know these studies very well because I was a co-investigator in these early seroprevalence studies with Jay Bhattacharya. You know, both of them were published in top journals, JAMA and International Journal of Epidemiology. But as you say, they got a lot of pushback because some people had preconceived answers of what the truth should be and, you know, that COVID-19 should be devastating across the board, not only in elderly and sick people with comorbidities, but also in adults who are young, who are healthy, also in children, on everyone. So yes, there are lots of biases of that sort. And sometimes these are also mixed with some intention to save the world. Like if people realize that this is not as high an infection fatality rate as we advocate, then our response may crumble, then people may get more frequently infected, then we may have a disaster. So I'm trying to think that people who lied or people who lied to themselves to start with and then to the community may have had pro-social considerations when they started lying to themselves and then to others. You know, they felt that they're saving the world in a sense by doing this. Some of them probably were just trying to make money, but I think that most were probably pro-social. I'm saving the world. I'm a good citizen. I'm a good public health servant. I serve the community by trashing truth. That's an interesting way to save the community, by telling lies. And downstream, eventually knowing that they're telling lies, but they've still felt, I'm still saving the community. I'm still saving the world. It's tragic. And then nobody's going to trust you. And saying that those people who don't trust you are just stupid, they're partisan, they're crazy, they're the wrong political party, they're against science, anti-science, or whatever, is just an excuse. The real reason is I'm lying, and this is why they're not trusting me any longer.
I think that the US medical system, in terms of trust numbers in the surveys, it took huge hits, right? I mean, compared to 10 years ago, I think we're in much worse shape today. And we've talked about this in previous podcasts, I think even in the one with you, that, you know, losing your reputation is so much easier than building it up. So after you've lost it, it's going to take a very long time to recover, which is very sad, I think.
Well, John, thank you very much for a very interesting conversation.
Thank you so much.
I think it's a lot of issues here. And I don't know, I think we really, as a society, should start confronting these issues.
I hope we have some more joyful stories next time.
Thanks for listening to All Else Equal podcast. Please leave us a review at Apple Podcasts. We love to hear from our listeners. And be sure to catch our next episode by subscribing or following the show wherever you listen to your podcasts. For more information and episodes, visit allelseequalpodcast.com or follow us on LinkedIn. The All Else Equal podcast is a joint production of the Lauder Institute at the University of Pennsylvania and the Graduate School of Business at Stanford University, and is produced by University FM.